What's up, guys? My name is Jake. Welcome to Abandoned, episode 28. This, of course, is the show where we talk about some of the most interesting abandoned places in the world. Way back in 2007, I remember seeing this blog post about this resort in the Bahamas, which Disney had supposedly left abandoned. It's been on our list of abandoned places to cover for a while, and I figured we should finally figure out the truth behind this long-lived urban legend. For a while now, there's been this thing called Mowgli's Palace. It originated from several online creepypasta posts, part of the Abandoned by Disney series. Some of the stories claim that Disney abandoned a resort in Emerald Isle in North Carolina, and, well, that's just completely untrue. There are some videos online from 2015 claiming that the abandoned water park they're exploring is in fact the abandoned Disney project called Mowgli's Palace. And while it is actually in Emerald Isle, North Carolina, it's, not true. It did used to be an extremely small water park that I guess is just now abandoned. So that brings us to the main urban legend, and that's Disney's abandoned island in the Bahamas. Alright, let me set the mood real quick. Okay, that's a bit much. You know what, I'll just tell you. So as the legend goes, Disney had built a property in the Bahamas, spent $30 million on it, and abandoned it after a hurricane. So is that actually the case? Does this place actually exist? Well, in short, yes, this place does actually exist. But what is the actual story behind it? We'll start off with where it is. The onshore resort is located in the Bahamas on an island called Great Guana Cay, which is part of the Abaco Islands. Way back in the 80s, the island was owned by a German businessman named Alfred Meister, who bought a significant portion of the island in 1982. It wasn't until 1989 when a company approached Alfred to build a cruise destination on the island. The company wasn't Disney, but instead a cruise line that Disney was partnered with, called Premier Cruise Lines. If you've never heard of them, their flagship vessel was the Big Red Boat, and throughout their fleet the ships were painted in a bold yet favorable red color. Premier Cruise Lines played a huge role in the cruise industry as really the first family-oriented cruise line. At the time, the industry was really focusing on the 40 to 50 plus age range, as families generally didn't take vacations on cruise ships. This wasn't until Premier came along with some really innovative and industry-changing practices they began implementing on their ships. In 1985, the company was on the rise and sailing out of the relatively unknown port called Port Canaveral. They approached Disney with a partnership deal, and with success, Premier became the official cruise line of Walt Disney World. So like I was saying, in the late 80s, Premier Cruise Line made an agreement with Alfred Meister to use the island as a destination for their ships. Meister would build the facility and dredge the underwater channel to allow the ships come into the bay. The ships would actually have to sail into the bay as the island was on the border of the Bahamas, and a vessel that large wouldn't be able to anchor offshore in the rough Atlantic seas. All of this would be built on the top northwest section of the island, called Baker's Bay, and essentially Premier would sign a contract to have the property exclusive to them as long as they continued to go there. Premier Cruise Lines definitely had something unique in the works for this, and to tell you a little more specifically about it, I got the exclusive opportunity to sit down with Bruce Narenberg, the co-founder and co-CEO of Premier Cruise Lines.
We went all out. We said, what's the best out-island experience we could create? Came up with the idea of making it a pirate theme, which I had mentioned to you the other day. And the idea was that this was, the fantasy was that this was the place where the pirates went on vacation, and it was their private island. And they really resented the fact that we came there with our cruise ship twice a week. So, as I mentioned to you, during the dinner, all of a sudden on the PA system, you would hear clanking swords and people yelling and screaming that was all piped into the dining room. And the captain would come on and he would say, I have terrible news. The ship has been attacked by pirates. They've taken over the bridge. So it's every man for themselves. And all of a sudden, Captain Hook, Mr. Shmee, Tinkerbell would all come storming in the dining room, and they would kidnap some of the passengers and literally put them in chains and drag them out of the dining room. It was all prearranged, of course. And then the cruise director would come in with the captain and say, we're going to deputize those of you that would like to help us go save your fellow passengers. We saw them sailing off to the island at night. The light, we used to torchlight the entire island. The bay area was absolutely gorgeous. And what the passengers didn't know, we had set up the midnight buffet on the island for them to go and their evening snacks. But we gave everybody some trinkets to go and trade with Captain Hook to try to get the passengers back. They got a complimentary pirate grog to go on shore to give them courage. And we staged the whole thing on the beach. Captain Hook was there, the people were waiting, and they negotiated the transaction to take. Of course, today, the humor might be lost because the word hostage today means something totally different than it did back then. Then it was all in good fun, but it was an incredible product. Matter of fact, we had the chairman of Carnival Cruise Lines, when they were buying the company, went on that cruise with his family. And I remember him coming off and saying, that might be the best product he's ever seen anywhere as far as just totally creating an experience for people in such a short period of time.
The island offered a very different experience that guests generally couldn't find anywhere else on any other cruise line. It offered fun activities for guests like parasailing, sea animal enclosures, sandbars, gift shops, and long secluded beaches. Around 15 to 20 buildings made up the facility, and additionally included a theater and a buffet. The name of this place was Treasure Cay, or Cay, it depends on how you pronounce it. They were also equipped with their own ferries to tender guests to and from the ship, as well as their own trams which would drive guests to other sides of the island for additional beach access. Disney characters would roam around the island taking pictures with guests, and during the evening the beaches would be lit with torches, and guests would even have the option to be able to camp out on the beach overnight. All of this sounds pretty amazing, and guests absolutely loved it. It was definitely a huge highlight of the cruise. So why would something this great only last with the company for a few years and eventually become abandoned? Well, first off, only one of Premier's ships would even be able to enter the port. See, the channel and the turning basin was only built large enough for Premier's ship, the Starship Majestic, which was only about 163 meters long and had a beam of around 23 meters. All of the other ships were just too large to safely enter the channel, so the facility could only be used by one ship every 4 or 5 days. Initially, this wasn't really a problem, as the Starship Majestic was a specialty cruise which sailed to the Abaco Islands. Having the Majestic be the only ship able to sail into the port made its cruises there much more special, since it was the only cruise that would be able to sail into this very special private island. However, following the exit of Premier's former CEOs, things began to fall apart.
Every once in a while, you'd have weather, and you couldn't get into Baker's Bay because the winds would be so strong that you couldn't get in the channel safely from the outside. And it was always up to the captain as to whether that was the case. Well, while Bjorn and I were there, they knew they couldn't pull any games and skip the island on purpose so they could go to Nassau and spend the time with their families. So we had a very high percentage of getting in, over 90%. Well, as soon as we left, that changed because now there was nobody keeping an eye on the store, and all of a sudden they started to go 80% of the time, and then 70% of the time, and then 60% of the time. And of course, now people were getting a cruise to Nassau instead of a cruise to the Pirate Kingdom. So it was a different animal. And Meister was losing the revenue because he got paid every time the ship came in to the harbor. So after we left, that's exactly what happened. And the Premier wanted to get out of that because if they went to Nassau, they could get subsidies and they would make money on the side and do this. So there was a lot of financial reasons. But at the end of the day, that's why it stopped. The product was always successful. Everybody was thrilled with it, and there was nothing else like it in the business. And it sort of really hurt when I heard that they were canceling the contract, because I knew what had happened. Because I knew the guys, and they're good men. They were good people, but it was a little selfish what actually happened, and it was unfortunate.
Premier Cruise Lines began intentionally skipping the island in favor of Nassau, Bahamas, under alleged false pretenses. This was done as the contract between Premier and Meister showed that if the weather would block the ship from coming into Baker's Bay more than 30% of the time, then Premier would legally be allowed to terminate the contract. So really, as a cost-saving tactic, that's exactly what they did. And by the mid-90s, Premier had now been sailing to Nassau and left the Treasure Cay property back with Alfred Meister. Really, no other cruise line could take over the deal Premier had left behind, as the channel and turning basin were just too small for any newer ships. It was also a problem that cruise ships just weren't really sailing to the Abaco Islands anymore. For Premiere though, things got a lot worse as in 1995, Disney had ended their contract for something Disney decided they wanted to do themselves. During this time, Disney was searching for land that they wanted to own themselves. So was the former Premiere property on Baker's Bay in consideration for Disney?
I'm sure that I know they were approached because Meister flew Disney executives out to see the facility in a helicopter, come on shore and see everything. Because he could have, the original Disney ship, the Disney Magic, I think it was called, was their first one. That wasn't that big a ship. Mm-hmm. So they could have brought a dredge in and made it a little bit bigger, a little bit wider, and they could have brought the first Disney ship in there. But I think Disney's idea was that, they weren't going to be in this just for one ship. They would probably build bigger, newer ships later on. So why invest in a place that could only take that size? And I think that was, I don't know this to be true, this is just my own opinion, that they certainly were not known for thinking small. They were usually known for thinking bigger. So they would say, look, if we're going to do this, let's go and do our own from scratch and make it as big as we want. And once that happened, I believe that they probably had some good discussions, but I doubt if Disney ever seriously thought about doing it. Mm-hmm. And I know they didn't ever get to any agreement that was walked away from or anything.
Right. Disney did end up purchasing an island called Treasure Cay and turned it into their own private island called Castaway Cay, and by 1998, Disney had launched their first ship called the Disney Magic. Premiere quickly fell from popularity, and by the year 2000, they had declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy and liquidated all of their ships. As for Treasure Cay in the Bahamas, well, honestly, after Premiere left the contract with the facility, it was just left abandoned. Nothing was done to keep the facility up to standards, and it really seems like following Disney's denial of acquiring it, the facility had no hope of ever being used again. So it was just left as it was when the Starship Majestic made its final voyage to the bay. As tropical storms and hurricanes battered the island, Treasure Cay became increasingly destroyed and enveloped by wildlife and tropical foliage. The dock that once platformed thousands of guests coming onto the island was now just pylons that jetted out into the bay. It is really sad to see such a beautiful tropical paradise slowly fall into an abandoned state. A place that entertained thousands was now nothing more than structures just left out in the thick forests of the island. So what ended up happening to Treasure Cay? Well, by 2005, it seems as though the locals on the island had begun scrapping some of the buildings for material goods. By 2006, a plan was released to the public showing a massive redevelopment to the island. The plan included a golf resort, an entire gated housing project, and a yacht marina, and this plan would overlap the former Treasure Cay. However, the project was met with great opposition as to the environmental impact this project would have on the mostly untouched native forest and coral reef. The development was from the Discovery Land Company, who bought more than 580 acres of private land for $25 million. The company vowed to put in over $175 million into this project and set aside land as a nature preserve. Despite this, people on the island hated this idea. However, the Discovery Land Company's project was pitched as an eco-sensitive project that would be cleaning up what was already on Baker's Bay from Premiere. And even though it wasn't really Premiere who contracted the dredging for their ships, the almost 2-mile-long underwater channel did have a rather large impact on the environment. However, it was nothing close to what Discovery Land Company had in the works. This whole thing turned out to be a huge controversy, with locals accusing the company of bribery and corruption, and people were even selling their homes on the island due to the massive development. But by 2006, construction began, and by 2012, a good portion of the project was finished. As for the former Treasure Cay property, well, it actually remained on the island for quite a while. During the initial land clearing phases of the Discovery Land project, the majority of the buildings and docks were removed. All but one large structure was left standing. It wasn't until late 2014 that the remaining structures of the former property were removed for the development of a residential property. So as of 2017, everything that was built onshore for Premiere Cruise Lines is now gone. The only remnant from the former Treasure Cay is the underwater channel and turning basin. It still remains underwater and mostly intact, and it will probably be used sometime in the future. The Baker's Bay Golf and Ocean Club is a very beautiful place. However, it was built at the cost of the local environment, which I don't really think is right. I also don't really understand why you need a golf course in the Bahamas. Allegedly, the homes on the island are becoming very difficult to sell, and the demand for them is apparently slumping. However, if you want to buy one that belongs to the club, you're going to be paying anywhere from $2.8 million all the way up to $12.7 million. Most people thought this was an abandoned by Disney urban legend, and while there is some truth to Disney's involvement, the real story behind this might be even more interesting. Treasure Cay only roughly lasted 6 years. It sat unused and abandoned for almost 20 years before it was taken down in favor of a new elite development. It's difficult to imagine that the secluded, beautiful land that the property was resting on would one day be replaced by a mansion. This fragment of the once powerful family cruise line was now only a forgotten cruise destination that most had no idea even existed. I had a great conversation with Bruce Nierenberg about Premier Cruise Lines, the cruise and travel industry as it is now, and much, much more. If you want to watch the full interview, I'll be putting it up on BrightSunFilms soon.